Alright, hello again. This is Jeff Scott of Blackhawk Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for our text Murex MySQL for the 152-147 Relational Database Development class for the spring 2016 semester at Blackhawk Technical College. And we've gone through the first 7 chapters, meaning, of course, we're on Chapter 8, which is on how to work with data types. So we're going to go over Chapter 8 on how to work with data types. Then we're going to go over Chapter 9, which talks about some of the built-in functions that exist in MySQL. And then we'll go into 10, 11, and 12, which is on database design. I do want to mention, you've seen this before, so sorry, but you're going to see it again. And that is that if I come and bring this up, and remember, this is dev.mysql.com/doc/refman/5.6 or 5.6/en. That's the reference manual for MySQL version 5.6. And if I bring it up here, the reason I'm doing this, not to waste my time, not to waste your time, but if we look over here, you'll notice there is an entire section on data types. So if I click that, that's got all the information I might want on the different data types. The next chapter of the book is on functions and operators. So again, there's that information. So that is always your biggest source, all right, your go-to place, whatever you want to call it, for information. All right, but let's get going. So again, we're on Chapter 8, how to work with data types. So, code queries that convert data from one data type to another. Describe data that can be stored in any of the character, numeric, date, time, and what are called different kinds of LOB for large object fields. Finally, we'll talk about the differences between enums and sets. Enums are very similar to what we've learned in other languages. Sets are kind of unique in here. We'll talk about the character data type, which is going to represent strings. Typically that's looked at in 3 different ways. It's either a char, which is a fixed character length. It's a varchar, which is a variable character length. But really, typically a char is around 256 character max. I could be wrong on that, but it's somewhere like that. A varchar is pretty much 65,536 character max, and if you go bigger than that, you typically use text for your field. All right. And then we've got numeric, and that can be something as simple as decimal, and I've shown you that before. There's different variants of int. There's different variants of float and double. So we'll talk about all those. And when we get into talking about that stuff, it's important to realize also that typically you can work with either things that are signed or things that are unsigned. What's the difference? Signed, of course, will allow negative values. Unsigned means only positive values, but it doubles the actual precision. And I shouldn't say the precision, but the actual. So if you could go to 2 billion, negative 2 billion plus to positive 2 billion plus with unsigned, all right, or with signed, I should say, when you go to unsigned, now it's 0 to positive 4 billion plus. All right, we'll talk about the different date and time stuff. I already mentioned the large object, and I don't even remember what spatial is, but we'll get there to that when we get to that point. So you've already seen this. Now, one thing to realize, and this is kind of confusing sometimes to people, when you use chars, notice if I say char 2, that's what's stored in there. But because of the way physically that this stuff is set up, each char that you put in actually needs 3 bytes to store the data. All right? Whereas with varchar, notice it needs whatever you use plus 1 byte. All right? So you might say, well, geez, then I should always use varchar because it would be simpler. Well, the advantage that you get with char is, again, the idea that it is a fixed length. So typically, like for state, for example, if you use a char of size 2, that sends at least a subliminal message to people that, well, then what we're going to be putting in there, it should be two characters. some of these terms to know. Some of this stuff is a little antiquated. And what do I mean by that? Well, that Latin 1 character set, I believe that was the default that was with MySQL, and that lasted until version 5.5, I believe. It might have even changed in 5.6. But the point is with this, the Latin character set covered basically Western languages, but didn't cover Eastern languages. Now we've got the UTF-8 character set, the Universal Transformation Format, 8-bit character set, and that supports the Unicode standard, which supports every language that currently exists. So if we look at some of these, how many bytes, etc., well, what that really involves is, again, you have zero fill. Let's go back and take a look at what we had just talked about a couple minutes ago, and that is this. So let's go over and we'll talk about, I believe that what I want to show you is in here. So let's go to numeric types, and we'll go into the integer types. There's the big thing. It's all about capacity. So a tiny int, as you can see, if it's unsigned, it's negative 128 to positive 127. All right? If it's signed, I should say. If it's unsigned, it's 0 to 255. The small int, signed, negative 32, 768 to positive 32, 767. Unsigned, 0 to 65, 535. And you can read the rest yourselves. All right? But again, what it all depends upon is exactly what you're looking for as far as the capacity that you need. Now, it's possible that you can go in there, as it mentions here, and you can zero fill things. Do you want to do that? Again, as always, it depends upon the situation. I'm not going to say, oh yeah, you'd never want to do that, or oh yeah, for sure you'd want to do that, because again, as I just mentioned, it will depend upon the situation. There may be a reason to do this. Fixed, so if we look at double, again, to me it makes much more sense to keep going back to this, and we'll go to the floating point stuff. All right, with float and double, there's got to be something in here. I thought there was, at least. Maybe it doesn't even show it. All right, but let's just take a look at what it says. All right, the first thing to realize is when you're working with things, quite often, I'm going to give a generalization now, but a lot of times people who work with databases, the stuff that they may be a really good database person, they may understand databases, they may understand everything it is that they have to understand, but they may or may not, depending on the size of the place, they may or may not be programmers. All right? And the reason that I bring that up is a lot of times you'll find people using the decimal type. So for instance, and you've seen this kind of thing before, but I want to show this to you. So if I've got a field, and this is an example I used before, if I say salary, and I know that no one who works for the company, no one, let's just say we know that the maximum salary anybody will have will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, .99. And before you say anything, think about this. What is that? That's $9,999,999.99. Now, if it's more than that, of course, you could change it, but let's suppose right now that you knew that would be the maximum. So what do we have? We've got a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 digits. So we could say decimal with 9 digits, and with those 9 digits, 2 come after the decimal place. So we could do that. If it turned out, oh, no, now they can make up to that, then all we have to do is change that to this. All right? So hopefully when you look at that, it makes sense to you. And the reason I'm bringing that up is there are a lot, truly, there are a lot of people who work with databases that don't worry about floats and doubles, etc. What they worry about is just having something set up to be big enough to hold whatever value they're trying to put in it. All right. Now the big thing when you work with floats and when you work with doubles are the fact with how many decimal places. All right. So, basically, if I go and set something up where I'm working with scientific calculations, I may want to work with type double because that gives me usually, I think it's up to about 15 places in my decimal after the decimal point. That might be very important if I'm doing some kind of scientific calculation. But if I'm not, I can use the decimal, I can use the float, or whatever. All right? So terms you should know. A real number, again, is one that can have a decimal place in it. All right, precision, you're talking about, typically with precision, how many points, how many places after the decimal point. Okay, scaling, what kind of scaling factor are you going to use? We're not even going to get into that in here. Exact numeric type, not sure exactly what they're talking about that in there. Whereas I guess you could say that if you're working with an int or a double or a float, that's more exact than to say decimal. All right, floating point number we've talked about, an approximate. Okay, we've sort of mentioned that. Now when you work with dates and times, the two main things to worry about or think about when you're talking about dates and times are, first, that when you are working with dates and times, all right, that dates have to be put in a year, dash, month, dash, day type of format. That's by default, that's the way that MySQL expects dates to be entered. That doesn't mean that you have to show them that way when you output them, but by default, that's the way that they're entered. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is you'll oftentimes see this as far as a date type, and that's timestamp. All right, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So those are two of the more important things when you're working with dates. Okay? All right, so you can see this in here, and they show you, again, some examples. And they're trying to show you here that that's really the way that you should be putting this stuff in there. All right? Now, you'll notice that a bunch of these work. What doesn't work are things other than either blanks, a dash, or a period, which is the universal separator. All right, but you can't use dashes. And you can't put in invalid dates. If you use a date time type, when you put in the date, the time comes along for the ride. If you set a date, you don't set the time, typically it's set to midnight. In other words, 00:00:00. All right, let's jump into and talk about enums. Enums are typically used for small values like this. So notice what they have here. How values are stored in enum columns. So they're setting up an enum there with yes, no, and maybe. Okay, I'm not sure exactly even what the possibly is doing there. But the idea is when you use an enum, what you're doing is you're telling the user, I'm going to give you one possibility. So I shouldn't say it that way. What they mean is they might give you a bunch of possibilities, but you're only going to choose one. So in other words, how likely are you going to be to vote this election? Or will you vote in this election? Yes, no, or maybe type of an idea, but you can't choose more than one. On the other hand, when you use sets, the idea is you can choose 0 or more. So they might say in here, what do you want on your pizza? So I might have any of these combinations that are shown here, or maybe some that are not even shown. Talking about object data types, notice they mentioned two of them there that are blob, which is a binary large object, and clob, which is a character large object. That is typically reserved for things like big maybe music files or video files or whatever, but something that really is huge. Because what happens then is you don't actually store that in the database. You store more or less a pointer to where that actually exists in the database. All right, next they talk about doing conversion. So it says explicitly converting a number to a string. Well, they put concat there, and they concatenated a $sign to an invoice total, and boom, it's a string. How does take a string and convert it to a number? All right, so they take a number and they divide it by the string, and it gives you a number. How do you explicitly convert? Well, this is the way it's done most often. If you literally add 1 to a value that holds a number, but it's not a number itself. All right, so if you say +1, now it becomes a number. So that takes a string value that holds numeric digits, and it literally will then convert it. All right, it will convert it to an actual number. If that doesn't work, or if that's not sufficient for you, you can also cast. So you use the word cast, and then you tell what it is, and they'll show an example of that in just a minute. There's also a convert. So here's an example of the cast. Now, do you want to do that? Again, the idea is not do you want to do that. It's do you need to do that, or is it something you might consider doing? It's always going to be, basically, it's going to be based on the circumstances. All right, and there's a convert example also. You can also do formatting. So if you notice what they've done in there, when you use the format function, it'll add the commas for you, and it'll do the formatting as far as in this case. It will also do the equivalent of rounding. And finally, this char function, as they mention in here. It says char function examples for common control characters, and they show some of them. If you wanted to go and add these characters yourself, that'd be the way to do it. And that pretty much is it for the chapter. So again, as previously mentioned, what we will be doing next is we will now be jumping into chapter 9, which is on functions. A lot longer, double the PowerPoints from the chapter that we just went through. Okay, so I'll be back with that presentation shortly.